Hi, fourth graders. This week we are going to read our last full story of our fourth grade year and of the fourth grade reading book. So next week we're going to have a review week, and then that's going to wrap up our reading for fourth grade. It's hard to believe that we're already at this point in our year and already at this story. So the story that we are going to read today is just a chapter from a bigger book called Skylark. And you've maybe heard of the book Skylark before, and you've really maybe heard of the book Sarah Plain and Tall. And so Sarah Plain and Tall Skylark is the sequel to the book Sarah Plain and Tall. And so the characters are going to be the same, and Skylark is just kind of what happens after the book Sarah Plain and Tall ends. And so this part in our book today, or our story today, is just a chapter from the larger book in this series of Sarah Plain and Tall and Skylark, and then there's a third one called Caleb's Story. So we're going to look at our vocab first today, like we always do. And over in the yellow box we have the words coyote, corral, coyote, drought, phonograph, and prairie. So I'm going to go ahead and read the story preview page here, and we can take a look at those vocabulary words and their meanings. Life on the prairie. Have you ever been to a place so wide open that it looked as though both land and sky could go on forever? A prairie is such a place, a vast, flat grassland. Often you can go miles without seeing a single tree, but you might get a peek at a prairie dog or hear a coyote and howl in the distance. Life on a prairie farm in the early 1900s was very different from life today. Many items we use every day had not even been invented yet, or else were very costly. Since there were no TVs or radios for entertainment, prairie farmers listened to records on the phonograph. That is, if they were lucky enough to own one. Water was not available from the faucet and had to be carried from nearby wells or streams. If there was a drought or dry spell, crops died. Wells could dry up, leaving nothing for people to drink. In Skylark, you will read about the painful choice one prairie family must make when their worst fears come true and the wells threaten to run dry. So here we have a picture of a prairie dog. We're just taking a look at the captions. Here is a howling coyote, and the caption says a family poses before their prairie home. The well in the foreground provided water. The horse was either kept in a barn or fenced into a corral. So taking a closer look at these vocabulary words, here we are with our vocab matched up with the definition. So drop down suddenly means, or slumped is drop down suddenly. Coyote is an animal similar to a wolf. A phonograph is an old-fashioned record player. A drought is a long period of little or no rain. A corral is a fenced-in area for cattle or horses. And a prairie is a flat or rolling grassland. So you'll have to do some work with these words in your packet for today. So make sure that you take a close look at them and then come back to this video if you need some help remembering their definitions. So here we are going to read Skylark by Patricia McLaughlin. This first part of our story right here, fourth graders, before we even get started, is kind of a background of what has happened in the Sarah Plain and Tall story and also what has happened already in the book Skylark. So they're just giving us some background information. Sarah has journeyed all the way from her home by the sea in Maine to marry Jacob and to live with her new family on their prairie farm. There she has grown to love Anna and Caleb, though she is sometimes homesick because the prairie, a sea of grass, is so different from Maine. After months of happiness together, the family is about to be tested by the forces of nature. The land they have worked so hard to farm is drying up fast. An empty glass placed on the fence by Caleb waits for the rain that does not come. All the family can do is watch the skies and hope. Sarah and I sat in the kitchen. The air was thick with the heat and there was no breeze. There hadn't been any wind for days. Sarah was writing a letter to the aunts in Maine. I wrote in my journal. Remember the wildflowers, I asked Sarah, and the roses that grew on the fence? Remember singing? Sarah looked up. Yes, she said. She reached out and touched my hair. I remember. Papa, Papa, coyote, Caleb shouted from outside. Sarah and I ran outside. By the paddock fence, a thin coyote was drinking water out of the water pail. He'll kill Moonbeam, shouted Caleb. Papa came from the field, took a step toward the coyote, then turned and ran toward the house. He came out with his rifle. Jacob, what are you going to do? Cried Sarah. Go inside, Sarah, he said. Papa raised his rifle to shoot the coyote, but Sarah grabbed the barrel of the rifle. No, don't do it, Jacob, don't. Sarah, stop, yelled Papa. Papa tried to push her away, and the coyote looked up at the sound of their voices. Slowly he ran away over the fields, stopping once to look back. Then he was gone. Sarah began to cry. He only wanted water. Water, Jacob. Caleb climbed over the paddock fence and stood next to me. Papa took Sarah's arm and turned to Caleb. Put the animals in the barn, Caleb, he said. Caleb turned and walked to the barn. Tears streamed down Sarah's face. Water, she said. He only wanted water, just like us. She slumped to the ground and put her hands over her face as she cried. Get Sarah something to drink, Anna, said Papa. He took off his hat and sat down on the ground next to her. Anna, he said sharply, now. I turned and went to the water barrel and scooped out a cup of water. Papa put his arms around Sarah. His voice was soft. Sarah, Sarah, he said softly, it will be all right. It will be all right. But Sarah cried, and when Papa turned and looked at me, I knew that nothing was all right. The look in his eyes was fear. And that night, when I came in from the barn to go to bed, there was something else missing from the fence. Missing like Sarah's roses. Caleb's glass was gone. They're coming, said Caleb, looking out the upstairs window. He wore a clean shirt and his hair was brushed smooth. I wore a dress that I had worn when Papa and Sarah were married. Outside wagons came into the yard. Will this make Sarah happy? Caleb asked me, worried. I watched more wagons drive in. I saw Maggie dressed in a rose dress and a straw hat. Yes, I said, this will make Sarah happy. Anna, Caleb, what is this? Said Sarah in the bedroom doorway. We whirled around, silent. Sarah walked to the window to look out too, but I took her hand and pulled her out into the hallway. Papa looked up the stairs at her. He wore a vest and his hair was slicked back. He smiled at her. Happy birthday, Sarah, he said. There are guests and presents, Sarah, said Caleb. But I'm not dressed, said Sarah. Then get dressed, said Papa softly. Outside there was a table in the shade of the house set with food and lemonade. Maggie and Matthew were there, and Rose and Violet and the baby. All the neighbors were there too. Papa carried something covered with a cloth out to the table. What is it? Asked Maggie. You'll see, said Papa. Here she is, someone said. We all turned and Sarah came out on the porch in her white dress. Happy birthday, Sarah, said Papa. Happy birthday, everyone called. Sarah smiled at the sight of them. Everyone washed and clean as if the prairie winds had stopped covering us all with dust. A present from the aunts, said Papa. He took the cloth away and there was a phonograph. I handed him a record and he put the needle on it. Suddenly music filled the yard. Sarah stared. Papa walked up to her and held out his hand. She smiled and came down the steps and they began to dance. Maggie and Matthew began to dance too, the baby between them. Everyone danced then in the dirt yard, the light around them all yellow like an old phonograph. Sarah buried her face in Papa's shoulder and Caleb smiled at me. And for a little while, as the sun began to set, as they danced, everyone forgot about the drought. For a while, everyone was happy again. Even Sarah. Even Papa. The last of the wagons left in the morning. Sarah and Papa waved goodbye. Caleb was asleep under the table and Papa took him off to bed. Then Papa helped Sarah carry the phonograph inside. I have a present for you, Sarah, I said. I handed her a small book. Anna, what is this? Said Sarah. It's a book I started. About you, about our family, I said. Papa went out onto the porch. Sarah sat down and opened the book. She began to read. When my mother... She stopped and looked at me. Then she began to read again. Papa stood outside the screen door listening. When my mother, Sarah, came, she came by train. I didn't know I'd love her, but Caleb did. Papa didn't know either, but he does love her. I have seen them kiss. Sarah smiled at me, and I have seen the way he looks at her and the way he touches her hair. My mother, Sarah, doesn't love the prairie. She tries, but she can't help remembering what she first knew. Sarah stopped and closed the book, holding it close to her. You like it? I said. I'll like it, Sarah said softly. She put her arms around me, and I saw Papa watching us. Sarah got up then and went to the door. It was a fine party, Jacob. She put her hand up, and he did too, so that they touched through the screen. I'd almost forgotten music, whispered Sarah. Then she looked past Papa at the fence post. Where's Caleb's glass, Jacob? Papa didn't speak. Put it back, please, Jacob, said Sarah. It should be there when it rains. Papa stared at Sarah, and when I went to bed later that night, I looked out and saw it there, shining and clean, on the fence post. The next day after the party, after the music and dancing, Matthew and Maggie's well went dry. They drove their wagon to our house to say goodbye, and I could hardly look at Sarah's face. The wagon was packed with furniture and clothes. Rose and Violet sat in the back, the baby on Maggie's lap. "I'm sorry to be leaving you, Jacob," said Matthew. "It's all right, Matthew. I know," said Papa. "I'll miss you," Sarah said to Maggie. Her face was tight to keep all her feelings from coming out. She reached out to touch the baby's hand. "We'll be back," said Maggie. Tears came down her face. "We'll be back," she repeated. The baby began to cry as the wagon drove out of the yard. When Sarah turned to look at Papa, tears sat at the corner of her eyes. "They'll be back," said Papa. He watched the clouds of dust that followed Matthew's wagon down the road. His eyes narrowed against the sunlight. That night I dreamed about roses and green fields and water, a glass of water on the fence post and ponds of water to swim in. Caleb spitting streams of water like in the air like a whale. Sarah laughing and splashing us with water. A sharp clap of thunder woke me. Lottie and Nick barked as lightning lit up the sky. I turned over in bed, but then Papa's voice from downstairs made me sit up. Sarah, it's a fire." I got up and rushed to the window, and there was a fire in the field close to the barn. Flames creeping up the fence, flames near the corral. I ran downstairs and out to the porch, Caleb behind me. Sarah was running, carrying wet sacks, her hair down her back. Sarah and Papa beat the flames around the corral. Then Papa stopped to let the frightened horses out. "Get the cows," he shouted to Sarah. Sarah ran to the barn and pulled the cows outside. "Shoo, shoo," she cried. Caleb ran down to get Moonbeam. "Get on the porch and stay there," Sarah shouted at him as he led Moonbeam away. I put my arm around Caleb. I could feel him trembling. Sarah screamed as some hay caught fire and the side of the barn burst into flame. "Buckets," shouted Papa. "Get buckets of water. Buckets." Sarah ran to the barrel and filled a bucket, running back to him as the fire grew. Papa grabbed it, and then Sarah stopped him. I couldn't hear what she said, but I knew what it was. It was the last barrel. Papa stood then and stared at the barn as flames caught the dry wood and then the roof. Sparks flew everywhere, and then part of the roof fell, and Sarah and Papa moved back. Sarah put her arm around Papa as the barn burned. They stood there watching for a long time. Papa turned once to look away from the fire, and I could see his eyes shining red from the fire. I had never seen Papa's face so sad. The sun came up in the morning the way it always did, but everything had changed. The barn was gone, only a few blackened timbers standing. The cows walked in the yard, the sheep in the cornfield, looking for green grass. I stood at my window and watched Sarah and Papa talking by the clothesline. I saw her shake her head no. I saw Papa take her hand. She took her hand again, then Papa put his arm around her. I knew we would have to go away. They told us at dinner time. "Maine," said Caleb. "Are you coming too, Papa?" Papa shook his head and looked at Sarah. "I have to stay here," he said softly. "I can't go away from the land." "Can Seal and the dogs come?" Caleb asked. Papa shook his head. "They'll be happier here," he said. "I'll take care of them." What will you do while we're gone, Papa?" asked Caleb. "I'll miss you," Papa said softly, reaching out to take Caleb's hand. He looked at me then, and as if he knew I would cry if I spoke, he took my hand too. "What will happen to us?" I asked after a moment. Papa looked at Sarah, and his words were for her. "We will write letters," he said, his voice soft. "We've written letters before, you know." After the terrible fire, Anna and Caleb and Sarah leave Papa behind to rebuild the farm. They travel to Maine to stay with Sarah's aunts, to learn more about their adventures in Maine, and to find out if they ever return home to rejoin Papa. Read the rest of the Patricia McLaughlin's Skylark.